Okay, our next speaker is going to be Dr. Ed Maguire. Ed recently came from American University to ASU. Ed has a long career in the field with respect to international work. Ed started off as a police officer back east. Ended up working towards his graduate degree, worked for the United Nations in a research department in Vienna. After graduating with his PhD, he moved on to the COPS office, the Office of Community-Oriented Policing, in which he worked as a analyst when the COPS office first was established. And then from that point, he went off to a university, and his area of focus began focusing on or continuing on to community-oriented policing. He's one of the standard bearers in terms of community policing research. He does a lot of work with practitioners and policymakers in terms of implementation of community-oriented policing. More lately, he's been working on issues surrounding protest policing that's been funded by the Office of Community-Oriented Policing. He presented to the President's Crime Commission on the issue on 21st century policing that was led by Chuck Ramsey is one of the folks. And Ed has spent a lot of time working in the Caribbean and Central America on a variety of issues related to police reform, and community policing. So with that, I'll turn it over to Ed.
Muchas gracias, El Jefe. Could you make this work, please? With all of your wisdom.
Here you go. This will. I can hear people snickering in the back because they know I don't know how to do this stuff. So.
Somehow we ended up with a blue screen. There's nothing quite like following somebody who is known as the #1 criminologist in the world. Thanks for that. Thank you for So, I'm going to just go ahead and get started, Chuck.
It's popping up now.
Oh, is it? Hey, all right. Well, not so much. That's okay. We'll do without it.
They call back to you guys.
Okay, no problem. We'll make it work. Okay, I wanted to just take a little step backwards for a moment and think about, or talk just very briefly about how is it we know what we know in criminology about issues like violence reduction. And you can extend this to other outcomes like fear reduction or satisfaction or trust in the police or other types of outcome measures. And so Thomas talked about what he called a meta-review, a review of reviews. One of the things I think it's important to emphasize is that a review, we have to add the third level, right? It's a review of reviews of original studies. So it's premised on the notion, first of all, that there are original studies. Second of all, that the reviews of those original studies include a lot of original studies, including studies that have not only been done in the US, in Britain and Australia, other developing or high-income countries, but also studies that have been done in the developing world. And so, for instance, we have reviews, we have systematic reviews that don't include original studies from other countries. And so when you do a review of reviews of original studies, there are a couple of steps removed. And so I'm going to add to Thomas's presentation, I agree with it in its entirety, but I'm going to add what I think are a couple of I'm going to overlap to some extent, I think most of his findings, and add some additional detail, apparently without the help of my PowerPoint, on how this works. So,
It's not a PowerPoint.
oh, it's a PDF.
Yeah. I'm trying to figure it out. I'm not a PC guy.
Okay.
Try. It'll be a minute.
Okay. So we'll start off with the idea of what's known as a systematic review. So when Thomas talked about doing a review of reviews, the reviews he's talking about are what we call systematic reviews. So you've got a whole lot of original studies that have been done out there. Okay. One of the things we need to keep in mind is those original studies are often done badly. They have weak research methods. They don't allow us to infer cause and effect in a way that we can be confident about. And so when you do these systematic reviews, a key part of conducting these systematic reviews is weeding out the bad studies and keeping the best studies that have what we call internal validity. And translated into plain English, it's high internal validity means you have confidence in being able to infer cause and effect that A, which would typically be some sort of crime prevention or intervention initiative, has a causal effect on an outcome like crime or violence or fear or disorder or those kinds of things. So these systematic reviews are a really important mechanism because sometimes when you go back and you read the entire body of original research, for instance, like my topic today, which is police initiatives or law enforcement initiatives to reduce violence, you have a lot of noise, you have a lot of bad research that you have to weed out. And so how we do that is we develop decision rules that are based on the quality of the methodology used in those original studies so that we're not biased, so that we're not using any biases that we might have in how we make those decisions, but we have systematic decision-making rules about which studies to include and which studies not to include. And then what we can do on top of a systematic review is a meta-analysis. And so a meta-analysis is a quantitative attempt to synthesize all of the research that has been done on a particular topic. How are we doing, amigo? Hey, all right. Yeah, just go full screen. Hey, we got there. Thank you, sir. Appreciate it. So, fortunately, one of the things that we have, there's this sort of cottage industry that has popped up. I think of them as evidence aggregators. And so these are organizations or groups or programs or initiatives to try to bring together all of the available research evidence in a variety of different domains, including violence and its prevention. And so we have one that I'm very involved in, which is called crimesolutions.gov. This is a National Institute of Justice funded initiative to try to consolidate all of the highest quality research evidence on a variety of topics related to crime and justice using a set of systematic decision rules to try to weed out the worst studies and only include the best studies. This is the thought process with crimesolutions.gov is to make available plain language summaries of the research that policymakers and practitioners can read, because some of the language that we as social scientists use is often difficult to decipher. We have our jargon, we have our methodology, we have our theoretical language and so forth, and some folks find that difficult to decipher. So with crimesolutions.gov, it's just simply a web portal for accessing plain language summaries of the best available research on a variety of topics related to crime and justice, including policing. And so on all of the law enforcement and policing related programs on crimesolutions.gov, I am behind the scenes the senior researcher who coordinates all of that. And so all of that research evidence that's featured up there, and I encourage all of you to take a look at it. Really, really helpful for trying to very quickly identify what works and what doesn't work for reducing crime, disorder, fear, violence, and other related criminological outcomes. But it's not the only one. You have OJJDP, the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, has a model programs guide that follows a similar process. We've got the Campbell Collaboration, which follows from an organization developed in the medical and health community called the Cochrane Collaboration, which seeks to do the same thing for health-related outcomes. So you've got health-related outcomes in the Cochrane Collaboration. You've got violence and criminological-related outcomes with the Campbell Collaboration. We've got the Blueprints for Healthy Youth Development, which tries to do the same thing, another group that tries to synthesize the available research evidence, and then the Center for Evidence-Based Crime Policy at George Mason University. The great thing about all of these groups is they're attempting to synthesize what we know and make it easily digestible for policymakers, practitioners, and others who can act on that research evidence. What I'm presenting here is from David Weisberg and John Eck. For me, it's a very, very simple framework for thinking about how to organize our knowledge on what works in policing. So here we have two axes. I don't know if you can read it at the back of the room, but the bottom axis here is level of focus. On the left, it's a low level of focus. On the right, it's a high level of focus. On this axis, we have what we call or what they call the diversity of approaches. And so at the bottom, you have mostly law enforcement. So it's not, we're relying primarily on arrest, use of force, and police presence and so forth as the primary tool for achieving an effect on crime. As you climb up that axis, you have a wider diversity of approaches. You can think of it as having more partners or a more diverse toolkit in which you're applying a variety of different tools and partners to be able to address crime. And so what we know from this way of approaching what works in policing, I like how simple it is that the lowest effect in terms of police effects on crime and violence is down here with the standard model of policing. As we travel outward on these axes, so we have a higher level of focus, we see more effective programming. As we travel upward on this axis, and so we have a more diverse array of approaches, we can think of it as a diverse array of tools, a diverse array of partners, community partners, and so forth, then we see more effective programs. And so what we have, the standard model of policing is the least effective. We have hotspots policing and community policing somewhere there in the middle, and we have problem-oriented policing in the upper right as being the most effective. Okay, so I'm going to walk through some of that a little bit. So community policing. So a meta-analysis containing 37 separate estimates of the effects of community policing, and this echoes what Thomas presented earlier, found that it has positive effects on citizen satisfaction, perceptions of disorder, and police legitimacy, but limited effects on crime and fear of crime. I want to emphasize here that in the definition of community policing that's used here, we're referring primarily to community outreach efforts, community partnership efforts, but those types of efforts without the problem-solving component. So without a specific attempt to focus on substantive community problems and address those problems. So it's simply the relationship building aspect alone is where we don't find evidence from this meta-analysis on crime, okay? Hotspots policing. The most up-to-date meta-analysis that I know of, I heard there was a new one recently, I haven't seen it yet, but a meta-analysis of 16 studies found that hotspots policing generates small but noteworthy crime reductions. And to echo something that Thomas said, we often think about whether these crime reduction, when we do hotspots policing, so police enter a hotspot or an area where there's a significant concentration of crime, whether crime displaces to outlying locations. There's often this debate about whether that occurs. One of the things that we find is we actually find the opposite, that when police crack down in a particular area using a hotspots approach, there's what criminologists call it a diffusion of benefits. So you can think about it, if you're cracking down in a donut hole, the effort actually has positive effects arranging around that donut hole to the whole donut, okay? So something like that. Just kind of the opposite of displacement, or at least it counterbalances the effects of displacement. The other thing that's interesting about this is when hotspots policing gets combined with problem-oriented policing, we see stronger effects. So those two things taken together can be powerful. The strongest effects we find from these meta-analyses are in problem-oriented policing. This is police focusing on narrowly defined problems. You can think about it as narrowly defined places, narrowly defined substantive types of problems. So you can think of an example of a problem-oriented policing focus, instead of being sort of youth drinking alcohol. It's kind of a generic way of thinking about a problem. The most effective problem-oriented policing interventions tend to define problems more narrowly. So youth drinking alcohol in a particular park. on, between a certain number of hours on a particular day. These are the more specific ways of defining what a problem is and developing interventions that are very specifically tailored around solving those narrowly defined or very specific problems. And so what we know is that problem-oriented policing is really effective when we develop these very targeted interventions that are meant to solve those very narrowly defined or specifically defined problems. Focused deterrence we can think of it as being a part of problem-oriented policing because we're focusing, as I mentioned earlier, on a very distinct subset of offenders and attempting to influence the behavioral choices of those offenders. And we see focused deterrence effects. We have a very, very strong and convincing body of research evidence that, for instance, if we focus our efforts on a subset of very violent offenders, so Thomas mentioned not all gangs are violent, some gangs are more violent than others, and if we look within gangs, not all people within gangs are shooters. We have people who are known to be much more violent within gangs, and so we're really, instead of taking on gangs writ large, we're really focusing on the particular gangs that are the most violent, and within those gangs, the gang members who are known to do most of the shooting or engage in most of the violence. That's what I mean by a high degree of focus. And then we bring a very diverse toolkit, coming back to that diagram that I mentioned earlier, so that you have the law enforcement related initiatives, but you also have the social services, job training, faith-based community, and other tools that are other partners that we're bringing to address those issues. One of the very interesting studies that came out recently, Liz Groff and Jerry Ratcliffe and their colleagues at Temple used a randomized controlled trial to look at offender-focused policing. And one of the things that they found was they attempted to identify the most prolific violent offenders within communities, and they paired it with a hotspots approach. And so when you had that offender focus together with the hotspots focus, so to go back to Thomas's chart, you've got a person-based approach and you've got a place-based approach. Combining those things led to some impressive reductions in crime and violence. Some takeaway themes, and then I'll wrap up. So one, to echo what we've heard from Thomas and from Alex, for many interventions we don't know if they're effective because they've not been properly evaluated. A lot of initiatives just simply haven't been evaluated. Some of them have been evaluated, but with really lousy evaluation designs, and so we don't know if they work. And that's a lousy place to be in, and we're in this place a lot, particularly in the Latin American, the Caribbean region. There's just not been a lot of high-quality research in the region on how to reduce violence. Second, evaluating the effectiveness of interventions using experimental or quasi-experimental designs. The best designs, the highest internal validity, the designs that allow us to infer cause and effect, helps us build a knowledge base about what works. And so the things that Alex talked about and that Thomas talked about, they're talking about that accumulation of research evidence that allows us to make confident statements about what practitioners and policymakers can do. So investing in that kind of research is really important for drawing those very decisive conclusions about what to do. Third, based on that diagram that I showed you earlier, focused interventions are more effective than generic interventions. And also drawing on that diagram, interventions that rely on a diversity of tactics. So not just arrest, not just flooding an area with police. Thinking more broadly about what police can do and with which partners and with what tools. So increasing that diversity of tactics, increasing the number of partners, and working together to address these issues. Those types of interventions tend to be more effective than ones that rely simply on law enforcement working alone. And with that, I'll stop. Thank you very much.
And on one of the slides, you mentioned that the focused deterrence associated with statistically significant crime reduction. The statement was followed by the strongest program effects were generated by evaluations that used the weakest research designs.
Yeah.
Now, you didn't say, there wasn't a follow-on to that, but is one to conclude that therefore We're not confident that those programs
No.
really demonstrated those results?
No, and I skipped over that. I should have addressed that. Thank you for a great question. And so this is something that we find not only with focused deterrence, but throughout criminology, we find that bad studies produce stronger effects than good studies. That being said, if we weed out the bad studies or the lousier studies, we're still left with a very robust body of research evidence on the effectiveness of focused deterrence. Thank you.
John.
Thanks. Ed, on the framework, not the framework, but you showed a graph, I guess, diversity of application, or correction, approaches, sorry. And there was it was distinguished between community-based policing and problem-oriented, which I know there's a lot of history there. But I'm just wondering if you think that's a distinction without much of a difference, especially considering, as you know, community policing includes problem solving as one of its basic tenets. So is that kind of blurred and maybe not as useful a distinction as it could otherwise be?
That's a great question, and some time ago I went back and sort of I reviewed the history of community policing, just the term and how it has evolved over time. And when it started primarily as community relations, community partnerships, engaging the community and these kinds of issues. And over time, it kind of blended with Herman Goldstein's notion of problem-oriented policing. So I feel like community policing started to sort of swallow up problem solving and problem-oriented policing and so forth. But this body of research was focusing primarily on community policing initiatives that involve community partnerships, relationship building, and those kinds of things, without necessarily the problem solving or problem-oriented policing. And for that matter, there's some of the problem-oriented policing literature that doesn't necessarily focus on the community partnerships and engagement piece. And so those have been kind of, it's true that in practice in a lot of the communities that we've done research in, the two go together. But there are also communities that define, we see, in fact, when we travel in the developing world, we see a lot of community policing without problem solving and without problem-oriented policing. You see that a lot in Latin America and the Caribbean. The definition of community policing often doesn't include problem solving or problem-oriented policing at all. It's more of a partnership building effort and so forth. And one of the things I just want to mention really quickly on this issue of community policing, I had the benefit of traveling with some of my Honduran colleagues and my ASU colleagues a few weeks ago to 3 cities in Honduras to hear about the very exciting, very novel, very interesting community policing efforts taking place this was in Tegucigalpa and San Pedro Sula and La Ceiba. Really fascinating stuff going on here. These are really, really high crime communities. These are communities, I think, to reference the question that Ken asked earlier, these are communities where, I think about one community where literally there just wasn't even a road for police to be able to drive a vehicle into it, to be able to engage in these kinds of efforts. Very dangerous communities in certain neighborhoods I'm talking about, not the entire cities, but certain neighborhoods where police couldn't even really enter the community without coming under great danger and so forth. And so we're talking about, in this case, a context in which these community policing efforts are taking place in a location that's very different from where most of that research evidence has happened. And so it's not necessarily community policing plus problem solving. It's, as Ken, goes right back to your question, Ken, earlier, it's building relationships with communities where there is deep and massively entrenched distrust of police, where if you ask citizens who they're afraid of, they're sometimes going to tell you they're afraid of the police before the police go in and do these sort of community engagement and partnership building efforts. And so one of the great questions that I have is, would this body of research evidence, would it change if we widen the context of where the research takes place? And so if you go into Laventille and Port of Spain, if you go into the garrison communities of Jamaica, if you go into these very violent communities in San Pedro Sula and so forth, are we going to find that community policing without the problem-solving component still doesn't work? I put a slide up in Honduras. It was kind of a challenge for my Honduran colleagues. And so it was listing The developing countries where there have been quasi-experimental or experimental evaluations of community policing, these are the only ones I could find. One was in Colombia, and one was in Trinidad and Tobago, it was mine. And so I put on the slide, Honduras, question mark. Like, let's do this work in Honduras. Let's do this work in Jamaica. Let's build on this body of research evidence so when somebody like Thomas comes along and presents a review of reviews, it's now not consisting almost primarily of work that's been done in the same places, Canada, or the US, Canada, Britain, Australia, and so forth. And really sort of thinking about widening where that research is taking place. And I think that's kind of our mission here as part of the center at ASU. Other questions?
Thomas, and then we have one more question, then we'll.
Just very quickly, you put up focused deterrence as a slide, and some people sort of refer to focused deterrence as a problem-oriented policing approach. Was that intentional? I just wanted to get your thing.
Yeah, I'm just flowing from the way when Anthony Braga and David Weisberg describe focused deterrence, they're typically describing it as a very specific application of problem-oriented policing principles paired with deterrence principles.
Well, I think that I have a problem that I'm curious, and I would like to hear about what you think about. It's that the kind of evaluation that usually they do in the United States and Angus Clarkson is very focused. You have a problem and you can build an experiment and isolate all the other factors and try to understand the intervention, the control group is the best way to evaluate. But, well, we have been working together in Uruguay, for example, in the experience about hotspots policing. No? The Uruguayan police that is trying to set up a PADO is a kind of experiment that it is very difficult to evaluate because how can we isolate this for the entire reform that they are doing, the Ministry of Interior, of the laws, and it's just is something that worries me. What about you?
You know, when you mentioned Uruguay, Claudia, you break my heart because it's the one time I went and got a grant and I had to give it back. And the reason I had to give it back, I got authorization from the police chief and various authorities in Uruguay to be able to do an experimental, a randomized controlled trial of predictive policing. It wasn't my intervention, somebody else's intervention, I'm just the evaluator. So they have 24 police districts in Montevideo, I think it's 24 police districts in Montevideo. They wanted to put the problem-oriented policing in 2. And for the rest, we could do whatever we wanted to do. So they gave me 22 districts to play with. We randomized them, we selected 11 to put the predictive policing, 11 would be business as usual, and then we waited for the intervention to be launched. And we waited, and we waited, and it was never launched. So it was very, very difficult to get that off the ground because what we had was a US-based vendor promising the moon and the stars and the sun to these criminal justice officials, and then just ultimately were never able to deliver. You raise a great point, and it's the same point that Thomas mentioned, which is it's really easy to use these methods to evaluate programs or projects or something that has definitive boundaries. But it's much more difficult to use these kinds of methods to evaluate entire institutions, entire systems, right? There's nothing to compare them against, right? And so the whole principle of being able to do this kind of research is the ability to be able to compare something to something else, some intervention versus some non-intervention condition. And you can't use those same methods. It's a great point that Thomas made earlier.
Thank you very much, Ed.
Thank you.